Okay. Today, we'll shift gears a little bit. And if you watched the video from last time, we talked about the war. And the war, the settling of the war, the Peace of Paris. We've created what the Declaration intended. Those 13 original British colonies have now become 13 independent states, which is what the Declaration said we were going to do, and it's what has happened. Woohoo! Okay, we've got all of this new territory. We've got territory from the Great Lakes south. We've got our western boundary set at the Mississippi River. We've got our eastern boundary set at the Atlantic Ocean. Our southern boundary is a little bit disputed between us and Spain, but we are free and independent. Any free and independent people now need to govern themselves. And the Declaration of Independence had promised that once they had gained independence, that they would set up a new government that would guarantee life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay? So, our first attempt goes into, gets into gear, even before the war is technically over. Okay? Throughout the war, the Second Continental Congress served as our government. It was the government that was in place. It's the government that handled the war effort. And it's also the government that is going to create the Articles of Confederation, which will become our first attempt at governing ourselves. Okay? We, as historians, and we as Americans, look back at the Articles. Okay, some of you may not have ever even heard of the Articles. But it's a disaster. And there are lots of reasons why. Okay? It's not that the people that framed this government were incompetent, because they're certainly not. They've orchestrated a revolution. They have governed a nation. They have faced down one of the biggest empires in the world. Okay, they're enlightened. They're educated. They're not stupid by any stretch of the imagination. But they are afraid. And fear sometimes leads you into bad directions. And all you got to do is watch horror movies to figure that out, right? Okay, let's go hide in the creepy castle. Okay, no. All right, but when you're afraid, you do dumb things. And we do. Okay, we really do. There's a reason why they are afraid. Okay, they have struggled for years to win their independence. Okay, some have given up, really, as the Declaration said. They pledged their lives, their honors. Okay, they have suffered. Their families have suffered. Okay, immeasurably. Many of the people that are involved in the war effort, okay, they're patriots to the core. They have been abroad. Ben Franklin's been to France. John Adams will go to France. Okay, leaving their families behind. Washington, okay, God knows how long Washington's been out in the field. Okay, so these guys have sacrificed a lot. But when it comes down to taking a look at government, they're afraid that if they create a strong government in the wake of all this, that strong government, they really sort of believed that adage that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That if they give the government too much power, it will do just like the British had done and begin to take away our rights. And so they err on the side of caution and go the other way. And they create a government that is way too weak. Okay? All right. What's the problem with creating weak government? We have expectations of government, right? What do we expect government to do? Pass laws, keep us safe. So if we go the other way, is it just as dangerous? Okay? Because we have expectations that government is supposed to protect us. But if we don't give that government any power to protect us, then what? We're in trouble, right?
Isn't that the reason why the Articles of Confederation passed?
Oh, they passed. They are government from 1781, well, yeah, really from the time the treaty is signed, from 1783 until 1789. So they are government for 6 years. Okay? The Articles of Confederation, like I said, is it's what happens when you're new to this. Okay? And so they have broken away. Now all of a sudden they're at this realization point that we got to govern ourselves. They don't want to make a mistake by giving a government too much power and them having to go right back to war again. So they go the other way. Okay? So if you do that, where are you going to put the power? Can't do that. Okay? Because remember, contract theory says we create government. Okay, so we've got to create a government. We can't just hold all the power. We have to give some of that power to the government. So if you're not going to give political power to a strong central government, who are you going to give it to? The states. Okay? What's a confederation? If you understand what a confederation is, then you get this right from the get-go. Okay? So, what's a confederation? Okay? All right, think about this. Okay? You have 13 independent states, okay, that are out here. Okay? So there you are. They range in size from very big, like Virginia, to very small, like Rhode Island. Okay? But there are 13 of them. They used to be colonies, now they're what? States. What did the Constitution say? They are what? Free and independent states. Okay? And so, what these 13 have become, essentially, are 13 independent nations. They're allied together. They're bound together, okay, because they all fought for the same thing. So, excuse me. So they are these 13 independent nations that are loosely bound together by what? Same goals, same objectives, but you got to have something that tugs the strings and keeps them all together. And that is, which had a different color, the central government, the national government. Okay? So, there we go. This, the national government. All right, under the Articles, this national government is going to have very little power. Okay, most of the political power is retained by each of the states, no matter what. Okay, so this is the way that they sort of dreamed it up. It really is modeled after a lot of the old colonial governments, okay? The founders are fearful that if they give too much power to that national government, that it is going to corrupt and it's going to take them down a road that they don't want to go down, okay? And so, what they essentially did was create a binding contract between the states. Okay, the article said that this is a contract between the states that is a firm league of friendship. Okay, what they called it. So we're 13 independent nations. We're all friends. Okay, we're going to give ourselves a very weak national government. We're going to give it a very limited amount of power to do some of the things that we need it to do, but we're going to keep the power. And they believed that that way they could keep, since they governed themselves before the revolution, they could govern themselves after the revolution. If you go back and look, they're in the articles, okay? You looked at the difference, and I'll tell you this a little bit later on. The difference between the powers that the national government has and the powers that the state governments have. State governments have tremendous power under the articles, okay? So they weren't afraid of giving power. They were afraid of giving power to a national government, okay? So keep that in mind. The structure of the articles and the structure of the government that they put into place looks like this, okay? I know it looks complicated, okay? But break it down. We are used to, in our experience, having three branches of government: executive, legislative, judicial, okay? You have to have executive power to enforce the law. You have to have legislative power to make the law. You have to have judicial power to interpret the law, okay? If you look up here, you see the problem, okay? When they craft this, they give no national executive. There is no national executive, okay? There's no executive power. They say that there could be a committee of the states to make decisions, but that's nothing, okay? That's still not a single executive or even a plural executive, okay? So no executive power. They created Congress, a Congress of the states. Each state sends delegates to the Congress, okay? So you have 13 delegations that come to that Congress. That Congress is a one-house legislature. It's called unicameral, okay? One house. Each state, no matter how many representatives you send to the Congress, each state has one vote. You vote by state. It took 9 of the 13 to make a law, agreeing on it. It took all 13, it took unanimous consent to change the articles. Okay, so let's say they wanted to make an executive a year or two down the road. It would take all 13 states to agree to that. What are your chances of doing that? Now, there's 13 of us in here. I couldn't get y'all to agree where we want to go eat breakfast, okay? If I said I'm going to go buy you guys breakfast, you would all argue about where we're going to go, okay? Right? So, it's a one-house legislature that's supposed to make law, okay? But it takes 9 of the 13 states to make law, and it takes 13 of the 13 states to change it. There's really no national judiciary, okay? State courts only. What's the problem with that? These
same laws with one state for another state.
Right. These states also have to interact with one another. Okay? Best example, trade. Okay? If you have goods that move from Georgia to South Carolina, or from Georgia to North Carolina, okay? You cross state boundaries. So what if South Carolina puts on legislation or puts in legislation that limits trade from Georgia to North Carolina? Okay? Well, wait a minute. These guys are supposed to be friends, right? Well, that makes everybody mad. So who do you have to go in and say, hey, South Carolina, you can't do that? Nobody. Okay? And there's a problem. So, no national court, no national executive. The only thing the national government really has is a Congress, a one-house Congress that can make law, if it can get 9 of the 13 states to agree to it, which is tough, okay? So, unicameral legislature, each state has one vote, okay? Congress technically has the authority to govern the country, but has no power, okay? Congress could call into session temporary courts to hear disputes among the states. But if that national government is so weak, are the states going to abide by a national government or a national committee that says, hey, South Carolina, you can't do that? Okay? It's a good question. Okay? All right. The national government technically was given these powers to declare war and make peace. So the national government, if we were threatened, okay, could technically declare war and make peace, make treaties with foreign countries, establish an army and navy, appoint high-ranking military officials, print and borrow money, establish weights and measures, hear disputes among the states related to trade. Okay, so let me go back. So that's what technically the national government could do. Okay, this list is misleading. Okay, because technically the national government was given these powers, but that didn't mean that they could do everything on this list. Okay, because of a couple of complexities. I'll give you an example. What does it say up there? Establish what? An army and a navy. Okay. How do you supply, equip, okay, that army? It takes what?
Money.
Okay. How much does an F-22 Raptor cost us as taxpayers? Okay. How much does a aircraft carrier cost us as taxpayers? Okay. Billions, right? So, equipping an army and navy, that's expensive, right? So the national government has to come up with some way to pay for that. What does that say? Congress is supposed to create an army and a navy, but what do they not have? What do the states not give the national government the power to do? How do you raise funds? What caused the Revolutionary War? Taxes. Okay? So they give the national government no power to tax them. Told you they were scared, right? There's a great example. Okay? They cannot tax, they cannot impose tariffs, they cannot collect duties. The three things really that led to us breaking away from England: tax disputes, duty disputes, trade, regulation of trade. The states deny that power to the national government. And so our national government has, look, what a great directive. Okay? This is me as president of the college sending you out there to create a football team. Okay? I give you no money for scholarships. I give you no money for equipment. Okay? That's going to be hard, right? And so, this is the situation. There's no executive branch. We already said that, so there's nothing to enforce the law. There's no power to control trade among the states, and that is a disaster waiting to happen. There is a reason today that Congress controls trade between the states. Anything that crosses state lines is regulated by Congress, okay, under our Constitution today, okay? And there's a reason for that, okay? There's no power to force the states to do what you tell them to do, okay? There's no power to regulate the value of the currency that you create. There is no power given to the national government to put a state in its place. Okay? So what if one of these 13 states up here goes rogue? Okay? What if one of these 13 states declares war on one of the other ones? You need a national government with a national army to go and say, no, you can't do that, right? We're all friends. This is a problem. Now, this is what a confederacy is, okay? Strong states, weak central government, okay? You have states with a ton of power. You have a national government with very little power. Okay. I don't want you to think that the articles and that these guys don't do anything, because they do, okay? There are a couple of things that they do well, okay? They did administer the war effort pretty well. They did negotiate the Treaty of Paris pretty well. But the one big thing that the Articles does very well is something called the Northwest Ordinance, okay? It deals with that big green blob up there called the Northwest Territory, okay? So we'll talk about that in a minute. But that is one thing that it does very well, okay? But everything else is kind of problematic, okay? If you boil it down and you take a look at the Articles leaves us in a precarious position in a couple of areas, especially in trade. How can a weak central government conduct trade with foreign nations? It can't. So really that falls to who? The states. How can a national government with no power to tax finance a nation, create an army and a navy? It can't. What if you have a national government that goes out and makes a treaty with a Native American group or a foreign power, and then one of the states says, no, I don't like that, right? How do you bring that state in line? And of course, one of the big bugaboos is how do you get these states to work with themselves? Okay, because remember, technically, they're independent nations. So how do they trade with each other without causing a trade war amongst themselves? Okay? And it's a great question. And that's the one that, it's really the one that brings the Articles down. Trade is probably the biggest reason that the Articles fail. Okay? That and no power to tax is really the major problem. Here in America, after the war, prices skyrocket, mainly because we're struggling in trade. So what government started doing is printing large amounts of paper money to cover the costs of the war. So we have a huge inflation as a result. Inflation bad, okay? Makes your money worthless, essentially, okay? And so we have internal problems like this. We have external problems like trade, okay? So when you go back and we say, and I ask you maybe on the next test to tell me why the Articles failed, okay? Putting into place a one-house Congress where you vote by state, who does that benefit? What? Which ones? Because every state is equal in a one-house Congress where every state votes as one state. Who does that benefit? Does that benefit Virginia or does that benefit Rhode Island? Rhode Island. Why? It's small, but it's on an equal footing, right? Because it is a state. Creating a government that is resistant to change is also problematic. What if they did not make it so hard to change the Articles? Could they have recognized problems and then started to address them and begun to change the articles over time? Perhaps. They can't tax, they can't raise armies, there's no executive branch, there's no judicial branch. So, the national government in many ways is dependent upon the states, and oftentimes the states don't do their due diligence because you can't force them to. And so these weaknesses are eventually going to catch up to the articles. But the biggest problem, and probably the most recognized problem, is the one of trade. Now, if we kind of took a look at the state constitutions, you go and look at each state government during this period. I told you they would be very strong. Most have strong executives with a veto, which they did not create in the articles, nor did they give to the national executive, because there isn't one. Most states have two house legislatures, an upper house and a lower house. The national government does not. Many states have bills of rights to protect your individual liberties. Does the national government? No. So, some of these state constitutions are pretty strong. Some guarantee republicanism, or Republican form of government. Okay? So, the states have tons of power, and they're not afraid to give the states power, but they are afraid to give the national government power. And it costs them dearly. Okay? All right, I did tell you that one of the things that the Articles does well is dealing with land. Okay? Throughout this period, Native Americans, as they were kind of moved off the land, were forced to give land to the government. So there will be Indian land cessions that are dealt with during this period as the Native Americans give up some of this land and move west. I told you that there is some disputed territory, okay? And there's still a dispute about this, okay, as we kind of set this boundary, okay? So between 1783 and 1796, this area down here, which is technically the Mississippi Territory, okay, is disputed, okay? You guys know that becomes Mississippi and Alabama, parts of Florida too, okay? But the biggest thing that they have to deal with, okay, is these western lands. All this land that was added when the treaty hit. After the treaty, many of these states rushed out here and started claiming all this land, okay? So if you look out here, you see that Virginia claimed this, New York claimed that, Connecticut claimed that, Massachusetts claimed. You can't do that, okay? And so the states, the existing states, are going to have to give up those claims. And that blue area that you see up there becomes the Northwest Territory. The states give up those claims to that land, and that becomes essentially a territory, a blank slate. Okay? Now, that's a great question. We have all this new land. We don't know what's out there. We don't know how much of it there really is. And how, when we get people out here, do we transition these areas from chunks of land to eventually what? States. And so the article sets a pattern, okay? In 1785, they passed what's called the Land Ordinance of 1785. The Land Ordinance of 1785 sent surveyors out into these territories to start surveying. And what they did was they went out and created baselines, turned this area into grids, okay? And these grids would then become how we surveyed land, sold off land, okay, and began to settle this land. Okay? So, you start up here. What you see right here is this little chunk of Ohio that juts up against Pennsylvania. Okay? So surveyors went out here, created a baseline, and then started running lines. Okay? Creating a grid. Each of these squares, okay, each of these squares is 36 square miles. Okay? 6 by 6 miles. Okay? If you guys remember, how do you get area? Length times width, right? So this is 36 square miles. So each of these little squares inside of that is 1 square mile, right? So they were then squared off like this, okay? And this becomes what's called a township, okay? It was registered in a land roll, okay? And then you could start selling it off. Today, if you go buy a house, you'll get a deed. Okay? One of the things that will be on that deed is what section you're in, what township you're in, okay? Because it's all done according to the Land Ordinance of 1785. If you are, and if you buy land or you buy a business, for example, and your business is in the 16th section, taxes are different because that section and revenue from that section is set aside for schools. So today, 16th section land, the revenue from 16th section land comes and is set aside for education. So, this is how land is divided, subdivided, and then sold off. Okay? Now, since it's sold off, and as people start to move out into these areas, we got to set some parameters. Okay? So that black area that you see up there is the Northwest Territory. Okay? Those states that you see listed, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, will all come out of this Northwest Territory. Okay? Eventually. So how do we get these pieces of territory to eventually become states? Okay? Statehood could be achieved in 3 stages. Okay? When people began to settle into an area and they decided to create a territory, okay, Congress, the National Congress, could appoint 3 judges and a governor to govern the territory. So 3 judges and a governor would be appointed by Congress to go out and govern the Ohio territory, or the Illinois territory, or the Indiana territory when it is organized, okay? So once it's organized, Congress sends out 3 judges and a governor to govern the territory. When the population reaches 5,000 adult males, 5,000 adult male landowners, okay? Because that's what it took to vote. When you get 5,000 adult male landowners, you can then have a territorial legislature. So now, think about it. You have a governor, who's an executive. You have a legislature, who is lawmaking. And then you have a judge, 3 judges actually, that is judicial. So they give these powers to the territories, but don't give it to the national government. When the population reaches 60,000, that territory could elect delegates to a state constitutional convention. So Ohio, when it gets 60,000 in population, could elect basically a territorial convention where they would draw up a state constitution, and then they could do what? Apply for statehood. Who do you apply to statehood for? Who do you apply to? The national government. You apply to Congress. Today you apply to Congress. Okay? So it is a congressional responsibility. this is still the pattern. If we got new territory somehow or another, okay, the new territories would have to meet these requirements. Okay, still the law of the land. In 1787, okay, this is what the United States looked like. These areas right here are settled areas. Really, the pink areas are where you saw the majority of the population. It's still on the East Coast. Okay? But as these territories start to organize and people are going to start moving west, this area is the frontier. Okay? And that's where they're going to move out into. All right. The articles, okay, like I told you guys, the articles are weak. They have several problems, and everybody starts to recognize them by the time you get a couple of years down the road. Okay? Washington, some of Washington's friends, they all started to talk to one another and say, I think we've got a problem. Okay? They even, several of Washington's friends from other states will meet at Mount Vernon, at Washington's home, and say, look, I think we have a problem with trade. Washington's home really sits on the border between Virginia and Maryland, okay? And so they start looking at one another and they go, how do we do this? Okay? And there is a hint of a problem. So some of Washington's friends and Washington himself started to say, look, we might need to have a talk about this. Okay? In 1786, they agreed to ask the states to send delegates to a meeting in Annapolis. Annapolis is in Maryland, right? So it's called the Annapolis Convention. What they want to do is talk about trade among the states, figuring out how to improve trade among the states. So only 5 states send representatives: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Virginia. But Virginia and New York, they're pretty big, okay? So is New Jersey. So these are some pretty big states. Pennsylvania is big too. Where's the most populous city in the nation in 1786? Philadelphia. So these are big states. They get together and they say, look, okay, we have some barriers in place that are limiting our trade. It limits our trade between each other. It limits our trade with foreign nations. And the only way we're going to survive is to do what? Improve trade. Time out. What did I tell you the national government could not do? Tax. So how does the nation get any kind of money? How do the states get any kind of money? Well, that's true. But how do they get commerce in? How do they get value in? They have to trade. Okay? The states could impose duties. The states could impose taxes and tariffs. Okay? So they need revenue. And they're having a major problem with it. And the articles can't help them, and the national government can't help them because what I tell you, it takes 13 states to change it. So, the members at the Annapolis Convention talk about this and they say, look, there's not enough of us here. They send a note to Congress and essentially tell the members of Congress, the National Congress, to call a meeting in Philadelphia for the next year so that they can adjust trade barriers. Okay? So that Philadelphia Convention that's slated for the next year is not going to adjust the articles. What's it going to do? write a constitution. They're going to chunk the articles and start over. They don't know that yet, but that's where they're headed. Now, in the meantime, all you need is something to go wrong to convince a lot of people that we need to have this meeting, and we get it. Okay? Oh, trust me, we get it. In 1786, 1787, a rebellion breaks out in Massachusetts, led by Daniel Shays. Okay? And it's not S-H-A-Y apostrophe S. His name is Shays. Okay? So Shays' Rebellion breaks out in 1786, 1787 in Massachusetts. Here's why. Massachusetts is a state. It can tax its own people. And it did. It taxed its own people pretty heavily after the Revolution. Okay? Why were they taxed? Massachusetts wanted to pay off its Revolutionary War debt. And it wanted to do so quickly. It may have been a guilt complex. Who had started the revolution? Okay? Where had all the violence been? Okay? And so Massachusettsans wanted to say, look, we're doing our share. We're going to pay off our debt. And so they taxed people heavily in Massachusetts, including the farmers. All right, what happens if you're a farmer and you can't pay your taxes? What does the state do? Takes away your land. That's doubly bad in the colonial period. Why? Well, in the early critical period here. There you go. Because you're not only losing your farm, you're not only losing your income, but you're also losing your ability to vote. Okay? And so many of these farmers, especially in western Massachusetts, they can't pay the taxes. And so they start getting their lands taken away from them. And Daniel Shays organizes a bunch of farmers and says that's it, we're done. And they revolt. And they revolt against the Massachusetts government. Okay? They will attack various parts of the Massachusetts government. Shays' Rebellion gets going. And now all of a sudden, what's the problem? Let's say Daniel Shays and Shays' Rebellion is successful in destroying the Massachusetts government. Okay? And more importantly, here's another thing to think of. What if all of a sudden Daniel Shays starts taking over Massachusetts and then decides to start taking over some of those places that Massachusetts lost, like Rhode Island or Connecticut? Who's supposed to stop him? Now, Shays' Rebellion fails. Anybody know why? Because Daniel Shays gets sick and dies in the middle of it. Okay? It's almost the same thing that happened when we talked about the rebellion in Virginia, when Bacon's rebellion in Virginia. Everything's going great until your leader gets sick and dies. And eventually Shays' Rebellion is put down. And the crisis is over. Well, look at what Washington says. There could be no stronger evidence of the want, the lack of energy in our governments than these disorders. Okay? He looks around and says, look, here's the best example I can give you. We got a state that goes crazy. We have no ability to deal with it. And so that meeting that's slated for Philadelphia now takes on even more importance. All right, I want you guys to remember this, okay? Because when we write a constitution, Washington faces a similar problem. When a bunch of Wahoo farmers in Pennsylvania revolt because the nation has started to tax whiskey. Okay? Under the Articles, the national government would have no power to deal with that. Under the Constitution, Washington takes the national army, takes command of it, rides his horse out to Pennsylvania along with the army, and gets out there and tells those farmers, if any of you aren't going to pay the tax, you'll get shot. What do the farmers start doing? Paying the tax. Okay? You've got to have an executive to enforce the law. You have to have the ability to enforce the law. And we eventually get it. But Shays' Rebellion, it's not there. And so Washington looks around and goes, hey, we got to fix this. Otherwise, we're going to lose what we fought so hard to attain. And that's why the Philadelphia Convention takes on even more importance. All right, we'll stop here. Okay. Friday's lecture will be the Constitution. I'll spend most of my time well, you guys are actually going to do your discussion on the Constitution. So I'll kind of go through the Constitution along with you, and then we will start to get into Washington's first administration. All right, see you guys.